Love him or loathe him, you cannot ignore him. He has been the center of American life for what is now essentially been a decade. But unless something completely unpredictable happens, he will be the center of our attention for at least 4 more years. Welcome to the Power of Ideas. This is the Astrology of Donald Trump. My email, it's new, tpo.ideas@gmail.com. I'm going to start each episode by giving you my email address. Please reach out if you have questions, comments, or concerns. Also, if after you hear this, you would like me to analyze your chart in a similar kind of way, I'll be happy to do that. Please reach out to that email for that to happen. All right. If you're listening to this, you probably are an old listener of the show, but things, as they say, are a-changin'. New format, new era. Here's the deal. I'm going to start by exploring certain ideas. Essentially, this is how I perceive the astrology I'll be discussing. However, I'll first delve into these concepts without the astrology. Though I guess that's not entirely true. I will be talking briefly about the ideas, but mainly it will be about the concepts themselves. Then later on, I'll bring the astrology back in. That way, if you don't care about astrology, you can just enjoy the analysis in the form of ideas. Let's get to it. First idea. In astrology, when we contemplate the different signs, we typically distill them into 1 or 2 word phrases or terms that condense their essence into a palatable, digestible, and easy to understand format. Astrologers sometimes like to pejoratively call this cookbook astrology. If you're simply like you're simply trying to make recipes out of someone's astrology, when it's obviously far more complex than that. They're not wrong for pejoratively calling it this. It can sometimes be an unhelpful oversimplification, but it can also often be helpful, just as simply creating an idea in a digestible way. So in today's case, this is very useful, as Donald Trump has a very important Leo signature. And so I'm going to tell you what my cookbook phrase is for Leo. You ready? The phrase is this: attention, retention. There are people in this world who just know how to captivate us. They instinctively understand what it takes to ensure they have the spotlight. In short, they're masters of retaining our attention. Icons like Michael Jackson, Robin Williams, and Arnold Schwarzenegger are the ones that come to my mind. They remained in the zeitgeist and in our minds through their myriad abilities. They continually succeeded in keeping us engaged. They are types of people equipped with some sort of instinctual, innate skill in attention retention. And love him or fucking loathe him, Donald Trump is currently the foremost expert in attention retention. Trump's ability to draw and retain attention goes beyond the stereotypical need for admiration. It's more than just getting attention. It's about sustaining interest and attention. In fact, he has been the center of the American universe for a decade and has been a fixture in American life for as long as I can remember. What is absolutely crucial to understanding attention retention is that while it often occurs through positivity, entertainment, and joy, it is not necessarily that way. Donald Trump, in some ways, was a entertainment fixture. He was in our imagination as a kind of caricature of American capitalism. And in that way, he was entertaining. He was joyful. He was positive. But that's not necessarily what he's become. In fact, in my opinion, I think that this is really unhelpful. I think this joyful, entertaining stereotype is unhelpful because it allows for people to see something like a Donald Trump, who is seen as a positive figure, become something else while still remaining to see him as positive. Okay, so what do I mean? So I think that this is really unhelpful because Leos are often seen as joyous, positive, and that distracts us from the kinds of damage it can cause. I'm not saying that Leos aren't positive. Love you. I love you, all you Leos out there. All I'm saying is that it can distract us from the damage that they can cause. So you heard that right. I am refuting the positive stereotype that Leos are always positive. I'm refuting the positive stereotype. I'm refuting the stereotype that Leos are always positive, right? I think it can help us. It makes us misunderstand the idea. In other words, the ability to attain retention can be honed through incredibly negative tactics. Here, you may be thinking, well, not all Leos are superstars. Obviously, that is true. In fact, not all Leos are consistently seeking out attention either. It is simply, what I'm saying is, it is simply that they have an instinct for understanding how to create attention. And if that intention can impact your success or perhaps help you evade failure, something like prison, you might use that instinct, that ability, that inherent skill for the purpose of evading failure, say losing an election or not going to prison. This is perhaps a tangent, but I think it's helpful. The other day I was in Los Angeles. Specifically, I was in Santa Monica. This is a really busy area, and cars go fast, and I saw an intersection, and the intersection was clear of cars. But there were a bunch of cars stopped before the light at the intersection, even though the light was green. So as I slowed down, I noticed a woman walking across the street. This woman was in a kind of dirty dress, looked sort of like a sad bumblebee. She had ripped stockings, 2 different shoes. One was a boot, another was a sneaker. Something weird was going on here. She weaved in and out of traffic, but mostly the traffic stood still. Eventually, she walked in front of my car, and I saw that not only did she have a crazy dress on it, she was very, very dirty. She also had a backpack that was in tatters. She had one of those like small stuffed animals that you attach to the zipper that was also in tatters. Her septum, that little part of your nose that connects your nostrils, was pierced, and hanging from it was this huge, enormous like ring that you would see something on like a bull or a cow. She had what looked to be some sort of prosthetic on her ears and made it look like she had elf ears. I don't know what that's about, but it was there. Most importantly, she was walking through an intersection in downtown Santa Monica at 4 p.m. This is mid-LA horrible traffic. In other words, very, very dangerous. Not only was she walking, but she was leisurely walking, just as if she was on a stroll on the beach. So the point is, she was telling everybody in her immediate vicinity that I'm going to take my time and you're going to fucking wait for me. Most importantly for this discussion, and as you may imagine, she did not look happy. She looked angry, downright despotic. The kind of look that made me happy I was in my car. And even though I was in my car, I was still a little bit worried. Like, what could she do? Hard to know. Now, unless you are actively making the decision to look away from this woman, which if you were in a car could actually lead to her death if you're moving, right? You were forced to look at her. Furthermore, every single aspect of this person leads almost any normal human being to look at her. And while her demeanor gave the impression that she kind of hated everyone and wanted nothing to do with people, every single piece of this woman screamed, "Look at me." I'm not saying this woman was a Leo, just to be clear, but I am saying that this woman did every single thing she possibly could to make certain that if you were in her physical orbit in any way, you will pay attention to her. She will retain your attention, even if it means she might risk death by getting hit by a car or something like jail time. That, my friends, is attention retention. And in this case, of the most negative sort. Also, I recognize what I likely witnessed was someone who was deeply in need of some sort of psychological help. And I don't want to seem insensitive. Though I must say, sometimes the need for attention can definitely be a psychological ailment. In fact, I think far too often friends, family members, colleagues, and peers dismiss Trump because they think he's crazy. Now, he might be crazy, but he might just be obsessed with getting attention. Give me attention. Instead, I think it's far more helpful to simply consider the idea that he has mastered attention retention, and the things that we are seeing that seem crazy are actually a skill. This woman that I saw crossing the street, that's not a skill. She was probably in a deep sort of psychologically sad place, but Let's just imagine, for instance, that she was happy, but she still had the bull ring on her nose. She still had the dress as a bumblebee. She still had the prosthetic ears. She's going to get your attention, right? It was the sad, kind of despotic, angry, weaving in and out of traffic stuff that was the kind of cherry on top. Maybe that's not the right phrase, but the point is, it's possible that she was doing all of the things that were not negative and she was not getting the attention that she needed. And then it turned to a different kind of attention. The point here is to illustrate that our attention can be manipulated if a person is willing to do anything to get and retain that attention. If it's positive, they will likely use that positivity to get their attention. But if that doesn't work, in my view, they will use any other means necessary. Idea 2, insistent resistance. I promise not all my phrases are going to rhyme, but in this case it works. So, what is insistent resistance? Have you ever met a toddler? I'm guessing you have. Toddlers are always learning the world. They are learning words and starting to be mobile, walking around, crawling around. And importantly, they have no sense of danger. Danger, of course, is learned. What does that mean? It means they must learn danger. One way to learn danger is to experience it. Don't touch the stove, a parent might say, or you might just let the toddler touch the stove. They likely never touch the hot stove again if you let them touch it. But unless you don't want your parent to, or you don't want your child to make it to 3, you don't let them touch the stove. So what do? Ask any parent the most common word that they say to their toddler, and in return, what becomes one of the most common words that they say in return? I'll give you a second to think about it. What did you guess? That word, most likely, is unequivocally no. Then what occurs? An entire era of no. Toddlers telling you no to everything. No means a whole assortment of things. It doesn't just actually mean no. It means feelings, most of which are just related to things that they don't like. You fall down? No. You want some carrots? No. You don't feel good? No. I thought you said you feel good? No. Here's the question. What if we never outgrew no? Or put differently, what if you learned what no was and then was never told no again? Or what if you learned, as is often taught, that no is just a temporary stop before yes? Suddenly you don't take no very seriously. Someone says you owe them money. Nope. Another person says you shouldn't say those types of things. No. After a while, it doesn't matter who tells you what reality is, you won't take no for an answer. For instance, maybe 81 million people say you lost the election. No. Where retention is the dominant idea that controls Trump as a person, insistent resistance is what dominates Donald Trump's career. And these two things are absolutely in connection with one another, and we'll talk about that when we talk about his astrology. But when we think about Donald Trump's career, what we need to think about is the way in which he resists insistently, even when reality is completely at odds with whatever he is resisting. Let's not get it twisted here, though. No is an important and underrated aspect of many parts of society. Resistance is important. Insistent resistance can be incredibly important. It can be the grit that pushes people to be better when they just want to stop. It can be the chip on your shoulder that pushes you to show someone who told you you weren't good enough that indeed you were. Insistent persistence is not inherently bad, just like attention retention is not always good. It is simply about which way that energy is directed. When I think of insistent resistance, I think of the man who stood in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square, or the civil rights activist who performed the sit-ins, or Muhammad Ali, who famously gave up his championship for 3 years in the prime of his life, resisting the war in Vietnam. These are examples of insistent resistance too. So just to be clear, Insistent resistance can sometimes be necessary. No is a very, very important word. At the same time, it can be a very, very destructive one too. Idea 3, an apparently impossible challenge. See, I told you that they wouldn't all rhyme. There are obstacles we face in life that, when they emerge, seem impassable. Indeed, they seem like a problem that is impossible. And some of them are. The road is collapsing and the bridge is out. This is the end of the road, literally. But sometimes the problem just seems impossible, or the road just seems impassable. Or perhaps, just when you thought the end was nigh, something happens. There's a different road. The road is actually not out, it's just a mirage. The universe provides an answer. But let's think about this. What if the problem was unpredictability in the face of a persistent threat of violence? That would be pretty scary. What if you simply never knew what someone would say or do to make other people say or do things that were unpredictable? What if someone said, I could go into the heart of Times Square and shoot someone and no one would do anything about it? Pretty scary. That could bring about violence. Or what if someone was nearly violently assassinated and implausibly, impossibly, unthinkably, they shifted their head at the exact right moment and avoided death? That would be a pretty interesting and impossible example of how unpredictability and violence may interact with one another when we think about something like an impossible challenge. I know what you're thinking. What is this music? This is my ad break music. I am currently soliciting people to support this podcast. That means that I'll advertise. I'm going to try and keep it creative. I'm going to try and have some limitations. But I need money. However, for now, this podcast is brought to you strictly through the support of members on Patreon. Through community support at 3 levels, I can create these podcasts free from the concerns of capitalism. Damn you, capitalism. If you are enjoying this, please consider supporting me and the podcast by becoming a member on Patreon. If you feel like you just want to support TPOI, there is a tier for you. You just want to be a supporter, and I appreciate you. If you feel like you want to be a supporter but also suggest ideas, but maybe you're just too shy and want to stay behind the safety of a keyboard, there's a tier for you. And if you feel like you have ideas that can contribute to the success of this podcast, like, I'm missing all the points, you don't get it, Ian, you need a good talking to, face-to-face, or at least Zoom face-to-face, there is a tier for you. And we are looking to build our community and team as the podcast grows, and this is how we want to start that process. By finding people who are committed to the purpose of the podcast, engaging in ideas through storytelling, archetypes, culture, sociology, and astrology. We want you to be a part of our community. You. So if that's you, become a member of the Power of Ideas Patreon community, and let's chat. All you got to do is go to patreon.com/TPOI. Part 2. Let's talk astrology. All right, y'all. This is the part where I bring the astrology back in. So if astrology isn't for you, feel free to tune out. Peace. But if you're ready to get into the nitty-gritty of Donald Trump's astrology, stick around. Let's get into it. Okay. So when you look at an astrological chart, there's a million things you can look at. However, in this case, I started by looking at Trump's first house of Leo, and then looked at his 10th house of Taurus. These were the two different ideas that I was talking about in part 1. Why do these matter? Well, every chart is different, and there are some other aspects of Trump's chart that we could look at and talk about, such as his interesting 12th house in Cancer, or his 11th house in Gemini, or his 5th house of fun and childhood where his moon is. That might give us an insight into why he seems so fucking childish. And maybe someday I will return to those. But for now, it is his 1st and his 10th house. And why? Well, because the 1st house represents you, the person, the personality, often the body. And the 10th house represents career, purpose, and what it is you are trying to build in this life. When I talked about attention retention, I was talking about Donald Trump as a person. He wants the attention on him, his personality, and his literal body. I mean, the man's hair is a symbol, and he even wears so much makeup that people call him the Orange Man. Orange, like the actual fucking sun. Leo is the representation of the sun. I'm just saying. But I digress. These things, while cute, certainly astrological and helpful to illuminate. See what I did there? Donald Trump as a Leo 1st house, they are actually less interesting than what is going on when we look deeper. Because not all those with Leo rising, i.e. a Leo 1st house like Donald Trump, paint their face orange and have hair so ridiculous it probably will become an icon that is written about in the history books. If history isn't shortly banned. TBD. It is actually that Donald Trump has a Leo 1st house and with his ascendant degree conjunct a fixed star called Regulus, which is also conjunct the planet Mars. And on top of all that, he is part of the boomer generation with Pluto and Leo, a generation of very old, me monsters that cannot see just how their selfish actions created far more havoc than they could have imagined, and importantly, probably wanted. In this case, however, the man simply doesn't care. So we already talked about his Leo in the 1st house. Attention, retention on the person, persona, the body. But what does it mean to have Mars, the planet of action, aggression, energy, and violence in the sign of Leo, where attention reigns supreme? Well, simply put, it means that your preferred method of attention retention is to fight. For many of you listening, the last thing you want to do is give any kind of reasonable attention or credence to Donald Trump's recent win. I hear you. However, I would highly recommend anyone interested in how his Mars and Leo manifests to watch the docuseries Unprecedented. It provides accounts of how his family describes him, and they repeatedly call him a fighter. His father's nickname for him was even Killer. What does that mean? Well, it means that love him or loathe him, Trump does not go down without a fight. His instinct is to always make it a fight. Indeed, whatever happens in the next 4 years, I guarantee you, the most iconic photo of Donald Trump will be the picture of him surrounded by Secret Service, blood on his face, fist in the air. And the picture, captured by a New York Times photographer who overheard him, and I'm just saying that because if he said it, you may not believe it, and I would not blame you. The photographer heard him saying, "Fight, fight, fight." Indeed, he will be remembered regardless of what happens as someone who liked to mix it up and retained all the attention for doing so. Importantly, I'm not saying that this is a necessarily good thing. I'm not giving Donald Trump a pat on the back for being a fighter. This is something that in astrology we often call astrology good. So maybe you're out there and you're thinking, I'm not a big Donald Trump fan. In this case, I would prefer not to hear anything good about Donald Trump, and you're perceiving me saying that Donald Trump is a fighter as good. I'm not saying that. Or on the other hand, maybe you're like, I'm just listening to this because I have some interest in Donald Trump and maybe I didn't vote for him. Maybe I did vote for him, and I like the idea that he's a fighter. Either way, it doesn't matter. In astrology, we would call this as astrology good, when something that you may not like matches the astrology. So I don't know how you feel about Donald Trump, but what you hopefully can't ignore is the fact that Mars, the planet of aggression, the planet of action and violence, is correlated with Donald Trump's physical presence. He will be remembered as somebody that is thought of as a fighter. His dad called him a killer. He had his fists raised in the air right after he was shot in the ear. And that is something very weird that I would call astrology good. Okay, so Trump is a fighter, and his fighting tendency brings him a lot of attention. But what about this fixed star I mentioned, Regulus? In the zodiac, there is a set of stars that some people think have deeper, more important meanings. They are fixed because they are so far away from our planet that they don't move in comparison to our perspective here on Earth. Yet, they are directly on what is called the ecliptic, or the line for which the zodiac rises and falls and sets on the horizon. And the one that is most significantly aligned with the zodiac is called Regulus. What does that mean? Well, maybe nothing. But I have to say, one of the first things I thought when I started thinking about Donald Trump astrologically was the fact that he is nearly impervious to attack. In fact, the fact that he moved his head so perfectly to avoid his assassination attempt has to strike anyone that is paying attention as absolutely fucking insane. I know that many in the evangelical world are placing very significant emphasis on this, as if he is divinely protected. And fuck, man, I gotta say, after everything, literally everything this man has gotten away from, avoided, and evaded, including even literally the Grim Reaper calling his number, I have started thinking what the meaning of it is too. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. The man's favorite food is McDonald's, and he somehow doesn't seem that unhealthy or unfazed at nearly 80. Meanwhile, Joe Biden can barely string together a set of words coherently. What kind of divine, celestial tomfoolery is going on here? I think it might have to do with Regulus. Regulus is known as the kingmaker, the king of the sun. It is the hero. It is this idea within our society that has to do with like the resurrection of the king. And Donald Trump's ascendant, which is conjunct his Mars, which simply means that at the moment he was born, the degree or the zodiac constellation that was rising was Leo, we know that, but also the degree of the fixed star Regulus, and right on its heels was Mars. So perhaps this man truly can get away with anything because of this damn fixed star Regulus. Now I know how that sounds. Please believe me, I know how that sounds. It sounded like I just made the case that Donald Trump is divinely, or at least celestially, protected by some powerful star in a distant galaxy. Yeah, I get it. The woo-woo is perhaps a bit too out there. Fair enough. But if you're still with me, stick with me just a little longer. First of all, welcome to Astrology Land, where we have to contemplate the fate versus free will conversation constantly. It is exhausting, I know. But my point is, I'm not saying that we should just roll over in defeat. In other words, I know it sounds like Trump cannot be defeated like fucking Voldemort or something. That is not what I am saying, nor what I believe. I am simply saying that if we take astrology seriously, we have to look for something that helps explain the sheer unbelievability that this man has never been held accountable for anything, ever, even including his actual body and mind becoming less feeble as time goes on. Now, I know a lot of you are probably like, yo, slow your roll. He has become more feeble. But I mean, just, objectively speaking, he is not as weak as many 78, 80-year-olds that I've seen. I should do one on Bernie Sanders, in fact, because he seems also a pretty strong elderly man. Anyways, tangent. My point is, his actual body and mind seem to be still sharp even when he does not take care of his body and mind. That's crazy. Why is that important? Well, because if we were just talking about legal accountability or social accountability, Maybe we could sociologically consider something like white supremacy or class hegemony, where the ruled enact behaviors that create conditions for them to continue to be ruled over. And that may be the case too. I am a sociologist as well. I think about these things too. But here, I am looking for an astrological explanation. And for now, this is what I got. But I want to be clear here. I'm not saying we must roll over in defeat. The lesson, if there is one, to be learned here is simply about the power of Leo, attention retention, Mars, and Regulus. It's about what it looks like when it manifests. That's it. Stay with me. Are you enjoying the podcast? If you're still here, I imagine you are enjoying the podcast. And in the previous self-advertising advertisement, I told you that this podcast is brought to you by members on Patreon, but maybe you don't have the money to contribute. I get it. Late-stage capitalism is crushing us all. So while the guilt of not contributing on Patreon is killing you, I know it is killing you, but you just can't. But you still want to support, and I appreciate that too. Here's what you can do. 2 things. First, you can share this episode with a friend, a family member, a colleague, a secret astrology friend. Everybody's got a secret astrology friend, a sociology major, or whoever you think would appreciate hearing it. Podcasts only get heard if they spread. So you can share this with someone and simply say, I think you'll like this. I do this all the time. And often I don't hear back from people, but then I send them another one and I send them another one until they finally listen and say, oh, that was really good. That's what you can do with this one. Send them to your friends. Annoy the shit out of them until they get back to you and tell you how awesome my show is. Second thing you can do is give this podcast a rating on iTunes or Spotify. Those are the big ones, and so that's the ones that I need the reviews for. The more reviews and ratings, the more legitimacy you give the podcast, and the higher it goes up in the search. Unless you're going to give it a bad rating. If you're going to give a bad rating, don't do that. Don't do that. Instead, send me an email. Tell me how I can do better. I would actually love to hear from you, seriously. My email, like I said in the beginning of the show, tpo.ideas@gmail.com. .cam. If you're from Boston, it's .cam. Reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, back to the show. Y'all ready for some advanced star talk? Because it's coming your way. Uranus square Mars. You probably don't know what that is. You're probably like, that sounds too weird. You're right. It is weird. It's about to get weird. If you don't know how predictive astrology works, here's a little primer. Essentially, each planet and each house or place in the sky, is maybe a better way of saying it, means something different. When a certain planet goes into a certain place in the sky, it corresponds with a different kind of theme in your chart or just theme in the world. So let's say Jupiter, the planet of growth, abundance, enthusiasm, goes into what is called your second house, the second place in the sky for you personally, which is the house of wealth, confidence, and money. And astrology would likely tell you something like, this is probably a time where you will see growth in your financial life. However, if you had another planet, such as Saturn, which is known for challenge, constraint, and hard work, in your 6th house or the 6th place in the sky for you, it would indicate something in terms of health and daily activities. An astrologer might say something like, you're going to have a time of growth in terms of money. That would be Jupiter. But it may come with adverse effects to your health. That would be Saturn in your 2nd house. Maybe you'll be working too hard, or maybe you will have to choose between one or the other. Or maybe it'll appear as if you can only have one and not the other. You can either have a lot of money, but bad health, or great health, but less money. In astrology, this is called a square. Does that make sense? Probably not. That's fine. Stick with me. Now, remember when I talked about an impossible challenge? Obstacles we face in life that, when they emerge, seem impassable or impossible? Well, I was talking about a square. In the case of Trump, he faced one of these twice already. Except the planets were different. They weren't Jupiter and Saturn. They were Uranus and Mars. Uranus, the planet of change, electricity, unpredictability, and explosiveness, which was in his 10th house. Think insistent resistance. Was square to Mars, the planet we already discussed. Action, energy, vigor, violence. That happened in his 1st house. the house of his self, his body, his personality. Can you guess what happened when Uranus transited his 10th house and was square, impossible challenge, to his Mars in his first house? Hopefully I've done a good job of contextualizing this situation, and it will be clear to you that what happened when that happened was his assassination attempt. And the second time it happened, another assassination attempt. If you didn't hear about it, Google it. Crazy. A guy hid in the tree at Mar-a-Lago overnight, and they caught him only because I think the gun was sticking out of the bushes. Wild. Now, importantly, I am definitely not predicting another assassination attempt. In fact, I really hope that does not happen, because frankly, I think it would be truly horrible and set off a series of events that we as a country may not be able to come back from. I'm very scared about that, in fact. Yeah, it's pretty scary to me to think about what that would mean. Plus, I don't want anybody to die. I just want him to go away. I just want him to just go away. Go home, man. Go live in a McDonald's somewhere. Tweet about it. Anyway, the point is that we can expect the unexpected. And, importantly, it may include violence. And that's very scary, I know. But I'm just putting it out there because that's what the astrology says. Expect the unexpected. When I was learning about astrology, the woman teaching me asked if I understood Uranus. I said, I think so. She said, you sure? I said, yeah. And she said, think again. And at the time I thought, this lady doesn't get it. She don't know I'm smart. I know shit. But now I can say that every time I encountered a Uranus transit, I learned something new. Expect the unexpected. That means Trump could do something weird. Or now that he's president, something crazy could not just happen to him, but happen to the country. Because oftentimes, and in medieval astrology, in ancient astrology, the king's astrology was the country's astrology. And that's really important. I'm not big into predictions, especially with Uranus, but in this case, I simply think it is worth mentioning. It's a good way to end, just to kind of put it all together here. Specifically because mentally and emotionally, I think we should all prepare ourselves for a really turbulent time. So the time that we should be thinking about, we should be looking at February 1st, between February 1st and July 7th. Obviously, that is essentially the first 5 months of his presidency. It's not really earth-shattering to predict it's going to be a turbulent time between the time when he gets inaugurated and the first 6 months of that. But it's just important because astrologically it is significant. So buckle up, kiddos. It's going to be a wild ride. If you want some very specific dates, keep tuned to what happens around April 22nd and May 7th. Those dates in particular may be the most consequential of those first 5 months. Finally, what did I mean when I was talking about insistent resistance? I was talking about Taurus. I know. If you are a Taurus, it may be rapidly dawning on you that I called you a toddler. First of all, it's a metaphor. Second of all, I'm a Taurus rising, so I have the right. Thirdly, if you're a Taurus, you know you're as stubborn as Sisyphus. If you don't know what that metaphor is, look it up. Sisyphus, very important story. And being stubborn, right after being an absolute liar, is undoubtedly one of Trump's most obvious qualities. The man never apologizes and never backs down. Remember the whole fighting thing? Yeah, this is part of that. Here's the wrinkle. Am I just saying that Trump is insistently resistant because it's a fancy way of saying he's stubborn? No. In fact, Trump's MC, which is also called the midheaven and is a representation of one's highest part in their chart, meaning it is the place in their chart where they are heading, where they are most visible, where they're most purposeful. It is conjunct another fixed star. Yeah, another fixed star. This one is much more infamous. It's called Algol. And it is known as one of the most challenging placements in all of the zodiac. I mean, depending on some other things. But yes, it's a tough place. Maybe someday I'll do a deep dive into Algol and my thoughts on it. It's pretty interesting. But for now, all you need to know is that this placement, essentially, in my view, pushes those with it to confront the darkest shadow side of the human condition. This often appears to happen through being seen as the victim, refusing to take accountability for your action as potentially harmful, and then showing little remorse for your behavior. Okay, actually, maybe it is helpful to provide some other examples. Otherwise, it sounds like I'm just picking on Trump. Not to say he does not deserve it, but it's just not very astrological. So, the notables that I have been paying attention to with serious algol placements are Donald Trump, Jordan Peterson, and Kanye West. That is a doozy of a trio. And importantly, all three of these figures, but most important for this episode, Donald Trump, have gone through intense transformations over the last, we'll say, 7 to 10 years, all of which are related to perceptions of being seen as the villain, then playing the victim, and essentially being unapologetic afterwards. But what is the astrology? That's what we want to know here. Well, over the last 7 years, Uranus, remember Uranus, unpredictability, square to Mars, that guy. Well, it was square to Mars from its place in Taurus, in Trump's 10th house, where it's been transforming societal issues such as money, food, stability, these types of things for everybody. But for Trump, it's been in his 10th house of career and purpose. Has anything significant happened to Trump's life related to career and purpose over the last 7 to 10 years? Yeah, just a little bit. But like I said earlier, and I will remind you again, Uranus is unpredictable, and it's been moving through Taurus towards Algol in his 10th house in the final year as he's being elected, as he's been elected and will be inaugurated into office. So all I can say is expect the unexpected. If Taurus is about being stubborn, about being insistently resistant, Uranus might mean more of that in the worst way possible, or it could break it. Can't be that resistant forever. I guess we'll see. So in summary, what do I mean? I mean that Trump is insistently resistant in his career because he is Taurus in the 10th house, and Algol conjunct his midheaven. That's a doozy. This amplifies his willingness to be seen as the villain and simultaneously play the victim. Moreover, this has been ignited into the public stratosphere as Uranus, the planet of excitement, electricity, and unpredictability, has been transiting his house for, we'll say, the last 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how you measure it. I know you astrologers out there are like, this is wildly inaccurate. It's not necessarily true. It's just I'm being pretty loose with these years. Lastly, expect this to ramp up over the next 7 months, specifically from January to July, as it crosses over Algol in Taurus. This is going to get real, my friends. All right, let's take a little moment for a segment I'm going to call Citations. You know, sometimes you're listening to something and think, where's this person getting this information from? It's a great question. I often think it. You go to the show notes, you see where they do it. If you're a nerd like me, you'll do that. Otherwise, you just kind of like wonder where they are. Well, I decided to put that into the podcast. So I got a little list mid-show, almost like an ad break, to share some of the main sources where I'm pulling this information from. Full transparency, these aren't the only places I'm getting my ideas. A lot of the time I'm pulling from just random notes, thoughts that I have on the street, something that I saw in a movie or in the news. But there are some key sources that shaped my perspective. Often it comes from documentaries. Last night I watched the Martha documentary. Might do a Martha Stewart astrology of, who knows. But I want to share with some of my citations with you for today's episode right now. Okay, number 1, a docuseries about Donald Trump called Unprecedented. This is a documentary about Donald Trump in the lead up to his 2016 win. It doesn't have any gotcha moments or shocking revelations, which I kind of thought it would. So if you're like interested in him seeing him as like worse or better than you expected, you aren't probably going to get that. It's kind of what you think, but it does give you a sense of him as a fighter. And also it shows his family dynamics, which is actually what I found most important and interesting. Fun fact, The filmmaker was shocked that Trump allowed him to have so much access, especially since he wasn't a Trump supporter. That was kind of what drew me to the documentary in the first place. I kind of thought, well, he probably won't have a pro-Trump leaning, I guess is the way that I was thinking about it. And that's kind of what you get. It's a very journalistic type of thing, but it does kind of give you, it just gives you insight into the way in which Trump and his family really saw themselves leading up to the win. Okay, number 2. I know you guys are going to hate me for this one, but I think everybody should listen to Joe Rogan's interview with Donald Trump. Two people that many people do not like, Joe Rogan and Donald Trump. But here's the thing, man. I got to say this because I think I mentioned him in the podcast. If you're not listening to Joe Rogan because you think you're doing some high-minded moral thing, you are missing out on an enormous group of people. So like, for instance, I just found a piece of data that showed that the Joe Rogan podcast is the number 1 podcast in the world. It gets 14 million downloads per month, which is 3 times as much as the number 2 podcast. So that's hard to kind of understand what it could qualitatively do to the way in which we think about things. But if you're moving out in the world and you're listening to people talk and listening to, ideas that are coming up and you're like, where is this coming from? And you're not listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, it's likely that you're not understanding why people are saying what they're saying. I mean, you can infer meaning, but you actually don't know. But by listening to it, you can kind of understand where it's coming from. This was really, really helpful for me as a teacher because I would hear young people, particularly young men, say things in class, and I'd be like, I know exactly where they're getting that from. That's coming from an episode that Joe Rogan had with Sam Harris or Neil deGrasse Tyson or whoever the fuck. And when I would go into my seminars, I would listen to people talking about stuff as if they understood what was the like contemporary understanding of like the youth or whatever. And I'd be like, that's not how people are thinking about it. And it was because they're reading these books, these high-minded philosophical books, but most of these young men and young people are listening to fucking Joe Rogan. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, Donald Trump did an interview with Joe Rogan, and some people think that it was the tipping point that led him to win this newest election. So I get it. Joe Rogan and Donald Trump in the same sentence and in the same place for 3 hours is not something you may want to be engaged in. You're rolling your eyes, but hear me out. This is probably the most important thing I've ever watched about Trump. Rogan's long-form interview style is what makes this worthwhile. You see Trump unfiltered for a long time, and it's rare to see politicians, especially a very prominent one, be talked to in such a way. So you see him unfiltered, and rather than the short clips that often people see him. I mean, if you're a Trump supporter, then you probably have listened to him for a longer time, but I had never listened to him for more than like 5 minutes because it was just hard for me. But it gave me the chance to see him as a person. And I think that's actually important. I often think that it's important to try and see the people that we villainize as humans, right? I think that's really an important thing. Even if you hate them, you should kind of try and understand them. I mean, there's controversy around that, like making a documentary about Jeffrey Dahmer and shit. But this is important because it can help you understand that, like, okay, people are horrible, but they are people. They come from a place, and this is really important. Okay, so do your best. If you can't do it, I get it, but I would absolutely recommend listening to the Joe Rogan podcast interview with Donald Trump. Finally, number 3, I would say that maybe the best thought piece on Donald Trump that I've ever heard was actually a conversation between a Washington Post columnist named Peggy Noonan and a kind of right center, although I think that she thinks of herself as left center, journalist named Barry Weiss on her podcast called Honestly. This is an interesting one. Peggy Noonan and Donald Trump have a long time frenemy type of relationship. And in her interview with Barry Weiss, they don't just talk about Trump, but he comes up over and over again because of that kind of contentious long-term relationship. So Noonan is incredibly articulate. She says things about Trump that I've always kind of felt but didn't know how to put into words. So she articulates a kind of, discomfort with him, but the need to kind of understand him in a more full sort of way. And she's just kind of incredibly charming and smart. Though I would kind of warn some of you if you're thinking, oh, this is probably like somebody that would be on the left side. It's more like the guy that I said did Unprecedented, who wasn't a Trump supporter. I don't think he was like a Trump hater. Peggy Noonan, I think, is more of a Trump hater, but she kind of thinks of herself, I think, as a conservative columnist for a relatively conservative journalist organization. And I just think these three things were the things. These are my citations for how I really came to understand Donald Trump outside of my own personal feelings for him. And that was helpful. And also, it just helped me contextualize what I was seeing in his astrological chart. One thing that Peggy Noonan said was that I thought was really, really interesting, which was revelatory for me thinking about Donald Trump's chart, was, he's very interested in sitting down with as many journalists as he can, because most politicians are afraid of going into the psychological depths of themselves, but he is not. And she said something to the effect of, that's because there's not very much psychological depth to him. And that's actually very, very well represented in his chart, because he's got some very interesting Venus Saturn placements and just some very childish, immature things, which were part of the way that I thought about him, even though I didn't talk about that as much. Okay, so that's it. Go to those places if you want. Those are my citations. Yep, those are my citations. This segment took way longer than I thought. All right, let's wrap it up. Donald Trump is not an ideologue. He's a narcissist. And here's the thing. People may love him because he is exactly that, a narcissist. What do I mean? Well, a narcissist can be easily manipulated by an ideologue, because all you need to do is cater to his narcissism. I love your hair, Donald. It shines so beautifully in the midsummer sun, like a translucent scrotum sack on the world's worst beach. All he hears is, it shines so beautifully. Great. Give me the launch codes. And he does. But here's the hard truth. I think people love him for reasons why people love to hate Leos generally. They're just good at getting attention. It reflects something about what we all want. I mean, who doesn't want to harness the power of the sun? Narcissism reflects something about all of us. We need to reflect on that. We need to embrace that. It is that we desire to be free enough to say what we feel and appreciate other people in a way that ultimately brings us attention and community, regardless of whether or not what we said to garner that attention and community was true. It simply feels good to have that attention sometimes. Love him or loathe him, Donald Trump is all of us. Yes, even those of you that are right now in this very moment saying, the hell he is. There is no part of me that is like Donald Trump. Yep, you too. You have at one point or another lied about your beliefs just to retain attention of those around you. You have at one point said something mean-spirited about other people's because it felt good. Not for you, but for those who you knew would give you attention. You have fought for causes you did not believe in, even if they were small and inconsequential, like a spat at the dinner table or a classroom debate. You have too. And you have been insistently resistant when you knew you should have just said you were wrong. You should have apologized, and you never thought about it that way. Donald Trump is a narcissist and willfully resistant to general norms of civility, and he is, in my opinion, unfit to run this country. But we all have a little Donald Trump in us. We are all in some ways and in some moments self-serving, narcissistic, and insistently resistant. And I think we're going to need to embrace that fact and reckon with that reality to face, fight, and survive the next 4 years.
You're alive. Don't take it for granted. Just because we don't understand it don't mean it ain't worth some planning. I'm on a natural high. I ain't worried about landing. Nah, I'm looking for planets. The only weapon I brandish is the intelligent mind. I don't buy in and never. I believe in the sky. I believe in the people. I don't fear a beretta. As soon as they download it, load it. Yeah, I live forever. Everything is art.
The Power of Ideas is no longer a one-person show. It is now a two-person show. And hopefully, if you get on Patreon, it will be a growing community of members. Either way, that means that there's credits. TPOI is brought to you by me, executive producer Ian Anthony, as well as co-producer Janella Gutierrez. Shout out Gia. She's going to help me out. I'm very grateful to her. Remember that you can go to Patreon and sign up to be a supporter. Hopefully we can grow this bad boy into something special. And subscribe, rate, review on iTunes and Spotify. Thanks for listening. Be your best idea.